I know we're a little bit late, so if you want to stay through the whole lecture, that's great. Otherwise, I can understand if you leave a little bit early. In fact, I was encouraged to do this lecture not simply by Dr. Chang, but also my sons. I have 5 sons who graduated from Princeton, so this is like old home week. Anyway, they encouraged me, and I suspect after they see this lecture, they'll probably give me some constructive criticism. Anyway, because of the time, I have a lot of slides. It's going to take about 30 minutes. Even with the 30 minutes, it'll be a little bit rushed, so there are a lot of notes at the end of the slides. If you want so if you want more details, you can access them there. So as Professor Chang said, the National Exchange Carriers Association sets access rates. I'll define those in a few minutes for more than 1,100, almost 1,100 rural telephone companies. And I suspect most people in this room don't realize that there are over 1,100 telephone companies out there, but there are. Our companies serve over 40% of the geographic area of the United States, but only have 5 million subscribers. So very sparse territories. And these are the areas that our members serve. So you can see it's Midwest, Far West, and Alaska. And if you superimposed Alaska over the 48 states, you'd see it's about a third of that territory. So it's really huge areas, very isolated communities. So what do I mean by an access rate? It's just a wholesale rate charged to retail providers of communication services. So for example, traditional rates were switched access rates, and those were charged to long-distance carriers like AT&T for completing long-distance calls over these local networks. AT&T doesn't have a network that goes to each individual customer. So our members would charge them for originating or terminating a long-distance call on the local network. There are other types of rates called special access rates. They're mainly data-associated rates or dedicated networks. So, for example, internet service providers buy from the local telephone company digital subscriber loop, DSL service. So that's the wholesale service for internet service providers. Wireless carriers, you may think that almost all of that traffic is going over the air. Well, it does for a small segment, but actually to backhaul that traffic to a mobile switching office and then farther into the network, actually wireless carriers buy a lot of landline facilities to connect their towers to mobile switching offices, for example. And finally, there are private line network providers. Some people don't want to use a public network. They want their own private network. Now, what are the demand trends for the traditional voice service, traditional long-distance service that you're familiar with? Well, that's a dying service. The connections to the internet are flattening out in rural areas. But broadband services, especially to wireless companies, are growing tremendously. And although digital subscriber line service demand for it is flattening, it doesn't mean that the amount of bandwidth used for the internet is flattening also. The customers are accessing video services now. So here are some charts to at least give you a sense of what's happening in the marketplace. And rural companies really are indicative of the bigger companies also. Now what I have here is annualized growth rates. So if you take, let's say, June of 2011 and divide by June of 2010, you can get an annualized growth rate. If you look at traditional long-distance service, you'll see that it's declining by about 10% per year. So it's pretty substantial, and it's been going on for quite some time. It's a legacy service. Digital subscriber line growth has actually been pretty strong, but it's reached a mature stage and it's only growing at about 4% per year. So flattening out. The big growth area, now this is all special access, that dedicated data type of traffic that includes digital subscriber lines, includes wireless backhaul and so on. This is growing at a relatively fast pace still at about 8 to 10% per year. And it tells you that wireless carriers need to buy special facilities to link their network, their towers, to their mobile switching offices. And because of 3G, 4G, and all these other applications, they're buying facilities at a rapid pace. So this isn't exactly a strictly correct definition, software-defined networks. I just wanted to get across the idea that there are networks that are basically defined virtually, and some of them have special transportation routes. Sometimes there's a tunneling of bandwidth for particular customers. And you can think of them as breaking up into public broadband networks like the internet. There are private broadband networks, and that's typically not right now it's in its infancy. Most large carriers will provide a virtual private network to their customers, but it's not that easy to go from one network to the next because the standards for transferring data, transferring packets from one network to another is still being worked out. And then there are hybrid networks, these private clouds, public clouds, and then a private network often will have access to the internet. So that's a hybrid network. And there are still physically separate networks. Some types of customers do not want to use facilities that anybody else can use. Expensive, but it's there. Now, when we get to network pricing, you've seen some mathematical models this morning. I want you to understand that pricing is really an art and a science. When you're trying to price, you're in this kind of zone of indeterminacy. You really don't know what's happened in the market yesterday. You probably don't know exactly what's going on in the market today, and you certainly don't know very well what's going to happen in next months or years. So you're in that zone of indeterminacy. There are a lot of reasonable solutions to pricing. And one thing that we've decided is, and you heard it earlier, is that you want to keep your pricing strategy simple unless there's a big payoff for not being simple. So for example, price could be set equal to unit cost for a particular service. Now, you don't want to set it, you may want to adjust that, be a little bit more flexible if some people are willing to pay a little bit extra for, luxury customers. So keep it simple, and the pricing itself, if it's simple, people understand. Second is you want to tap market information. If you're setting a price, if you're setting a price, well, you're not setting it in isolation. There are many other entities out there that are setting prices also. You might as well piggyback on it. However, they may face different market conditions than you do, and you may not agree with their pricing strategy. For example, the economic models treat customers as extremely rational. And they actually decide with a lot of information over a long time horizon. It could be an infinite time horizon. That's not the case in the actual market. You may, for example, see a lot of empirical work on what the people people may demand based on the price in the market and some other demographic factors. You have to keep in mind also that most of these models are not terribly stable. You may get a relationship and it looks good, and then you look at it 3 years from now and it no longer works. And you'll find that typically these empirical models assume a stability in the market that often isn't there, and they often rely on to test the significance of relationships on what's known as asymptotic theory, where the distribution becomes stable, usually a chi-square as time goes to infinity. And chances are you've seen that if you watch the options market or the financial meltdown, that a lot of these models are not, they assume a stability that isn't there. So prices should also, so science is good because it does help you, with all those caveats, it does help you structure your inquiry, because these models do highlight important factors that you ought to consider in pricing, and the empirical work can identify some basic challenges. So I'm not saying that science is quite important in trying to set a pricing strategy, but don't treat it as if it's mechanical, okay? Mechanical engineering or something along those lines. Now, you should also think of price in context. It generates revenue, but it's also a marketing tool. How do I get it back? It's back. Okay. So let me go on, and here are the three areas that I'll talk about in depth. Is our basic pricing model, implementation issues associated with the pricing model, and I'll give you a simple example from DSL, Digital Subscriber Line, how we price, okay? So one thing to keep in mind is the basic pricing model that we use. Now, you've focused on demand today. Well, there's the supply side also, and you'll find in economics textbooks that this kind of model isn't at odds with, terribly at odds with what you'll find in an economics textbook for long-run pricing. The top equation just says the price of a service must equal its operating costs plus, now that's direct investment in the service, the particular equipment associated. You multiply it by R, which is a targeted rate of return, which turns it into a rental price. And you divide it by the amount of units that you're selling. So basically, you have operating costs plus rental costs associated with the service divided by the units, and that gives you a unit direct cost for this service. And then you raise it by a markup, and the markup could depend on market conditions, okay? And that could take into account the demand side. It could take into account other types of factors. And because this is a mature industry, you use this for a particular service, but for all services, you want revenue in total from all of your services to equal the total operating costs that you have, plus the rental cost of your equipment in total, plus the rental price of your overhead. And what do I mean by overhead? So direct investment is in, let's say, the multiplexers associated with a particular service, any type of server equipment. Overhead is really buildings, cars, and so on. You have to recover those costs also. You have to pay back your investors, and you have to pay off loans. So your revenue, if you're in a mature market, ought to generate enough to cover your costs, including a return on investment. So let's now, even that simple model is too difficult in a lot of cases, because a lot of times you can't associate. You have a couple of workers out in the field, and the operating costs associated with a particular service is not easy to pin down. So what we do is we look at the whole income statement of a company, and we look at the total direct investment, the total operating cost of a company, and we get a factor called B. So once we do that, we link operating costs for a particular service to a direct investment in a particular service. So if you go back, you'll see that we had operating costs plus rental price. Now we're going to link price completely to equipment by making this connection with operating costs. And we call this a direct cost factor. And so R is the required rate of return for investors, and then you add a little bit to cover operating costs. Okay, that's the way to understand it. So let me talk about some of the implementation issues. You know, it seems like a simple model. Remember, we're talking about wholesale services that are sold to companies that are trying to produce retail communication service. First of all, we're going to have to define the service. Second, we have to figure out what we mean by that R, that targeted rate of return. Third, we have to talk about what the unit costs are, and finally the markup. And none of them are particularly, I'm going to go through all the complications and then make it simple at the end to give you a sense of what's going on. So first of all, what is the service that you're providing on a wholesale basis? Well, I think these should be familiar: upload and download speeds, reliability of connection and throughput. You could also have I should have put in special switching and routing to improve class of service. Class of service is just prioritizing packets. Quality of service is to improve the smooth streaming of it so you don't have jitter when you look at television sets. Security and privacy. So those are some of the features. Some of these are hard to measure their value. And the other kind of emerging way of looking at our wholesale services is to look at our network as a platform. And there are two sides to a platform. It's the end user side and the other side where they're getting access to, let's say, websites. And this platform approach, for example, I guess the most concrete example is if you own a singles bar, that's the platform. Men and women come in. They're the two sides of the market. And then the question is, who should you charge, the men or the women? And typically you charge the men an entrance fee into the platform, the bar, and women go free. So who pays for some of these services? You could look at it from a platform approach. All right, so I've defined the service. It's bandwidth, quality of service, class of service, and so on. It could be other types of features of a smart network. If you remember, the basic pricing model had direct investment times R to make it a rental price. Well, what is that targeted rate of return? And I won't go into it. I put some notes onto these slides, but one thing that you should notice is that there are a lot of financial theories out there. You can open up textbooks and they look really fancy. There are all sorts of models out there. In general, they don't work too well. Again, it's an art more than a science, and that's why we've had financial meltdowns. Let me give you a concrete example. Which is the right interest rate to apply to a rural telephone company's network if they're borrowing? Is it a mortgage rate at 4% or a credit card debt rate at 15%? A mortgage rate at 4% is usually low because you make a big down payment, you can sell off the house, there's a lot of screening of the customer. With credit card debt, there isn't a down payment, there isn't a house there. Think about a rural telephone company. Suppose it goes bankrupt. What can you sell? The copper in the ground or the fiber in the ground if it's not doing well? So the question is, which is the right cost of debt? And I could go through the cost of equity and so on. The answer is it's by no means clear. And you can, and none of these theories are, if you ever take financial investment theory or option theory, the models have their challenges. So next is, well, okay, let's look at unit costs. Now we've linked everything, the unit cost, to direct investment. So what is the direct investment? There's loop, and it could be fiber, copper, fixed wireless. Each one has a different cost structure. You buy it for a different price. There are ports that have speeds and features, equipment. There's a transport backbone for routing and distance, and the same transport backbone is used by many services. So how do you split that out? And then there are special features that are usually built into the port. Now, all of this is your own network, but a lot of times you have to pay to interconnect with another network, so you have to take that into account. And as you've heard before, there are congestion costs that you may want to take into account to make the use of your network more efficient and improve the customer experience. And one thing that's often overlooked is billing costs. A lot of times you have a very nice way of pricing a service package, but it's very difficult to bill. And if that's the case, you need a bill to make money. So finally, let's go to the markup. That was the last part of the equation, if you remember. There was price is equal to direct costs, unit costs plus times a markup. Well, how do you set a markup? You want to keep it simple so that customers understand. You want it to be consistent across services. So in the car industry, for example, the markup is higher on luxury items, luxury cars as opposed to the economy cars. However, that may not be the case in telecommunications. It may turn out that heavy users of the internet, for example, may be more price sensitive than light users, and that turns out to be the case. You want to avoid arbitrage. You're selling a lot of different services to different types of customers. For example, we talked about DSL. Suppose you're selling a symmetric DSL of 4 megabits. It's a best effort service, but there's a kind of Cadillac service associated which is called DSX services, where you provide very high quality of service. Well, yeah, it may turn out if you price DSL so cheap that others will move away from the high price, high quality, high price service to this, and you may lose revenue. So you want to avoid those arbitrage opportunities, and you probably want to use markups to reduce congestion. And I think in this course you'll go over quite a bit of state-dependent pricing. You want to avoid, in your markup, you want to avoid stranded investment. This is something you won't get to in this class, but let me give you a simple example. Suppose you do some special construction for a wireless carrier. You're building a special line from their tower back to their mobile switching office. Now suppose they say to you, the wireless company says, I only want it on a month-to-month basis. Give me a price month to month. Well, that tells me that if they wanted to, they could walk away from the service and build their own. Well, I've just invested quite a bit of money in this construction. If you want to have that flexibility, I'm going to raise the price. And you'll find that in option theory. I think there's a course even in the engineering school on that. But that's often, we often take that into account. And you want to develop a glide path for pushing people from legacy services that are high maintenance. There are still analog dedicated lines out there, and people still use them. Well, you try, and you can't, you have to maintain them, and the equipment isn't there anymore. You have to keep raising the prices to encourage these customers to move to a more efficient type of service. And you want to align your prices with other carriers. You don't want to have your DSL rates at $200 and everybody else is at $10. So you have to take those in. And finally, this is pricing of networks, communication networks, is subject to a lot of regulation, and you have to take that into account. There's, you can't run afoul of public policy. There's comparable services, comparable prices as part of the Telecommunications Act. If you price in such a way that it looks like you're not being neutral in the marketplace, somebody will come after you. And if your pricing technique requires a lot of deep packet inspection that may be used elsewhere, well, there may be some privacy constraints. You have to be very careful about that. So let me end up with a simple example, and it illustrates how the service provided and regulation come into play. This is an example of DSL where we have a 25 megabit upload speed and 50 download. Now, to provide this type of service, you need to have fiber to the home, basically. Not necessarily, but in general. Now look at this. There's a link cost, a line cost from the customer's premises back to the, let's say, the telephone company's office. Now, if you notice, I have a $0 there. Obviously, that costs money, that link. Well, it turns out because of regulation, if you buy local service, local telephone service from the local telephone company, and you buy DSL above it, you're not charged for the line for DSL. So you're only charged for the electronics. Next, we have a port cost. There are a lot of central office and field equipment that's necessary to provide DSL service. You're multiplexing in the field, demultiplexing, and so on. Well, the port costs are $649.52 for this particular type of customer. Then there are transport costs. Remember, the transport, a lot of the backbone is a ring, and it's transporting service, all sorts of services. So it's a combined, a lot of traffic is combined on there. Well, let's say somebody off to the side has figured out what the transport costs are per megabit per mile for this backbone infrastructure. Well, then we look at DSL and we find out that the average transport is 9.25 miles, and there's an oversubscription rate of 20 to 1. In other words, if you have 20 DSL customers, they're not all using the backbone at the same time. So you can actually have 20 of these types of customers, and they only use one equivalent type of amount of capacity in the backbone. So we have an oversubscription here of 20 customers. With video, that's going to come way down, real-time video. But when this was done, it was 20 customers. And we get 3 cents per megabit. And you remember the direct cost factor? There's a return to investors, plus a little bit extra for operating costs. That's 15.49% per year. So now we take all of this together. We take the direct investment, that's line 1 and line 2, times line 4 divided by 12, the direct cost factor, divided by 12 to make it a monthly charge because the rate of return is per year. And then we add in the 3 cents per megabit times 50 megabits download, and that gives you a transport cost per month. And that gives you the direct costs, unit costs associated with this particular DSL. The actual rate we set was $21.17, so the markup is 109% for this type of customer, just based on market conditions.